February 1959. 9 young hikers enter the Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia on what should be a challenging but routine winter expedition. They're experienced, they're prepared, they're confident. 3 weeks later, a search party finds their tent on a remote mountainside, ripped open from the inside, abandoned in the middle of the night. The hikers' footprints lead away into the darkness, some of them barefoot in temperatures 30 degrees below zero. Over the next several weeks, all 9 bodies are found scattered across the frozen landscape. What investigators discover defies explanation. Massive internal injuries with no external wounds, missing body parts, traces of radiation, and a scene that suggests these experienced mountaineers fled their shelter in absolute terror, choosing certain death in the frozen wilderness over whatever waited inside that tent. The Soviet authorities investigated, then abruptly closed the case, declaring the deaths were caused by a compelling natural force. The files were sealed. The area was closed to hikers for 3 years. 65 years later, despite modern investigations and official explanations, the mystery endures. What happened on that mountain? What could terrify 9 experienced hikers so completely that they would rather face the lethal cold than stay in their shelter? The mountain knows, but it's not telling. In January of 1959, a small group of students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute began planning an ambitious winter expedition. Their goal was simple in words but demanding in reality: to reach a Torton mountain in the far northern Urals. It was the kind of trek that tested endurance, discipline, and winter survival, exactly the sort of challenge that earned a hiker the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering. These were not beginners. They were skilled, confident, and experienced young people who understood the cold, the terrain, and the risks. The leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, meticulous, organized, and respected for his experience. With him were 8 others: Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishchenko, both 24, both seasoned hikers; Lyudmila Dubinina, 21, tough, determined, one of the few women in Soviet mountaineering; Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, a close friend of Igor's; Rustam Slobodin, 23, a strong and capable outdoorsman; Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 24, a skilled skier with French roots; Alexander Kolevatov, quiet, methodical, dependable; and finally, Semyon Zolotaryov, 37, a veteran of the wilderness who had requested to join the group. They left by train on January 25th. Then by truck, traveling as far as the last inhabited settlement, a small village called Vizhai. From there, they continued on foot and ski, deeper into the quiet wilderness. The journey was difficult, but everything was going according to plan. They took photographs, smiling in the snow, setting up camp, skiing through the forest. Moments of simple joy in the middle of a harsh winter landscape. One member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill and had to turn back on January 28th. He said goodbye to his friends, watched them disappear into the mountains, and never saw any of them alive again. The group moved on toward Torton. According to their schedule, they were to complete the route and send a telegram by February 12th confirming their safe return. That message never arrived. By February 20th, after every reasonable delay had been exhausted, the families demanded action. Search teams were formed: volunteers, students from the institute, police, even military personnel with helicopters. They had a planned route to follow. They knew roughly where the group should be. But the Ural Mountains in winter are vast, cold, and unforgiving. Finding the hikers would be anything but easy. On February 26th, the search party found the tent. It was pitched on the slope of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, which translates to Dead Mountain. The tent was still standing, partially collapsed under snow, but secured. From a distance, it looked almost normal, as if the hikers might simply be inside sleeping. But as the searchers approached, they realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. The tent had been cut open, not from the outside as if something had attacked it, but from the inside, long slashes made by knives wielded by the people who should have been sheltering there. The tent's entrance was still sealed and covered in snow. The hikers hadn't exited through the door. They had cut their way out through the fabric and fled into the night. Inside the tent, everything was still relatively organized. Sleeping bags were laid out. Belongings were neatly arranged. There were no signs of a fight, no signs of an attack, but there were boots, coats, cold weather gear that any experienced hiker would know was absolutely essential for survival in these conditions. The hikers had abandoned all of it. Outside the tent, the searchers found footprints, 8 or 9 sets of prints leading away down the slope, heading toward a forest about 1.5 miles away. The prints were measured and analyzed later. They showed that the hikers had been walking, not running at first. Some were in socks, some were barefoot. A few had only one boot. They had left the safety of their tent in the middle of the night, in temperatures estimated at 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, without proper clothing, and walked calmly into the darkness. The footprints were visible for several hundred meters before the wind and snow obscured them, but the direction was clear. They had headed for the tree line. The search party followed the trail. At the edge of the forest, under a large cedar tree, they found the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko were lying near the remains of a small fire. They were dressed only in underwear. Both had died from hypothermia. The branches of the cedar tree above them were broken. Someone had climbed up high into the tree, breaking branches as they went. Why? Were they trying to see something, get away from something? The searchers didn't know, but it was clear these 2 had made a fire, tried to stay warm, and failed. The cold had killed them. Over the next several days, 3 more bodies were found. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found about halfway between the cedar tree and the tent, as if she had been trying to make it back. She was face down in the snow, her hands clenched into fists. Rustam Slobodin was found further along the same path, also apparently trying to return to the tent. Igor Dyatlov, the group leader, was found even closer to the tent, on his back, one hand gripping a branch. All 3 had died from hypothermia. It appeared they had tried to return to the safety of their shelter, but succumbed to the cold before they could make it. 5 bodies found, 4 still missing. The search continued, now focusing on the forest and the ravine beyond the cedar tree. But snow and difficult conditions slowed the effort. It would be more than 2 months before the final 4 bodies were discovered, and when they were, the mystery deepened into something far more disturbing than simple hypothermia. On May 4, 1959, the last 4 bodies were found in a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. Unlike the first 5, who had clearly died from exposure to the cold, these 4 had different stories to tell. Stories written in their injuries, stories that made no sense. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov had not died from hypothermia. They had suffered massive trauma. Thibault-Brignol had a fractured skull. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had major chest fractures, broken ribs, damaged internal organs. The medical examiner described the force required to cause such injuries as equivalent to a car crash, but there were no external wounds. No cuts, no bruises on the outside of the body, no signs of a fight or an attack. The bones and organs had been crushed by some enormous force, but the skin was intact. How does that happen? More disturbing still were the missing body parts. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. These were not predation injuries. The medical examiner noted they appeared to have been removed before death, or very shortly after. The bodies had been lying in a stream under the snow, but the removal of these specific parts remained unexplained. And then there was the clothing. The 4 bodies found in the ravine were better dressed than the first 5, but they were wearing pieces of each other's clothes. Dubinina was wearing Krivonischenko's torn trousers. Zolotaryov wore Dubinina's hat and coat. They had stripped clothing from their friends' bodies after they died, trying desperately to stay warm. But some of this clothing, when examined, tested positive for radiation. Not extremely high levels, but detectable contamination beyond normal background radiation. The Soviet investigators noted it in their reports, but offered no explanation. The autopsies revealed one more strange detail, as several of the bodies had unusual discoloration of the skin, described as having a deep brown tan or orange tint. Some had foam around their mouths. These details were documented, but never explained. The investigating authorities seemed more interested in closing the case than understanding it. The final official conclusion, delivered after months of investigation, stated that the deaths were caused by a compelling natural force which the hikers were unable to overcome. No specifics. No real explanation, just a phrase that said everything and nothing at once. The case was closed. The files were sealed and classified. The area around the mountain was declared off limits to hikers and expeditions for the next 3 years. Families were given no real answers. The 9 bodies were buried, and the Soviet government moved on, leaving behind only questions and that inadequate, haunting phrase, a compelling natural force. For more than 60 years, investigators, researchers, and amateur detectives have tried to solve the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Dozens of theories have been proposed, ranging from the rational to the bizarre. Some are supported by evidence, none of them explain everything. The most recent official explanation came in 2020 when Russian authorities reopened the case. They concluded that a rare type of avalanche, possibly triggered by the hikers cutting into the snow to level their tent platform, could have struck the tent in the middle of the night. This would explain why the hikers cut their way out and fled. They were escaping what they thought was an avalanche. The panic would explain leaving without proper clothing. And if some were caught in the snowslide, it could explain the internal injuries. The theory has some support from scientists who study snow dynamics and avalanche behavior, but it has significant problems. Experienced mountaineers like Dyatlov's group would not have camped in an avalanche-prone area. The tent was not buried or heavily damaged by snow. The footprints leading away showed calm, measured steps at first, not the chaotic panic of people fleeing an avalanche. And an avalanche doesn't explain the radiation, the missing body parts, or why they walked a mile and a half away rather than simply moving the tent. Another theory involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can be created by wind moving over mountain terrain. In rare conditions, these sound waves can cause feelings of dread, panic, nausea, and irrational fear in humans. If the hikers were caught in such conditions, it might explain why they fled the tent in terror despite no visible threat. They could have been experiencing a kind of mass panic induced by these sound waves. It's an intriguing theory, but infrasound doesn't cause physical injuries or explain the radiation. Some researchers point to katabatic winds, sudden, powerful downdrafts of cold air that can occur in mountain environments. These winds can reach extremely high speeds and might have damaged the tent or created conditions that terrified the hikers. But again, experienced mountaineers would know about such winds and would not abandon their only shelter. And it doesn't account for the specific injuries found on the bodies. The radiation traces have led to theories involving Soviet military testing. The area was not far from military installations, and the late 1950s were a time of active weapons development in the Soviet Union. Some theorize the hikers accidentally witnessed a military test, perhaps of a missile or some kind of weapon, and were caught in the aftermath. The secrecy, the sealed files, the radiation all fit this theory. But if the military wanted them dead, why the elaborate mystery? Why not just shoot them and be done with it? And how does a weapon cause people to cut their way out of a tent and walk a mile in their underwear? Another explanation focuses on paradoxical undressing, a known phenomenon where people dying from hypothermia become confused and remove their clothing, feeling irrationally hot even as they freeze. This could explain why the hikers were poorly dressed. Combined with hypothermia-induced disorientation, it might explain their bizarre behavior. But this theory falls apart when you consider that paradoxical undressing occurs in the late stages of hypothermia, after someone has been exposed to cold for some time. The Dyatlov group fled the tent immediately before hypothermia would have set in. Something drove them out, and that something remains unexplained. Then there are the more sensational theories. Locals in the region had legends about the area, warning that Kholat Syakhl was dangerous, that wild men or spirits inhabited the mountains. In fact, there's a Mansi legend about 9 hunters who died on that very mountain in the past. Some have suggested the hikers encountered something unknown, whether called a yeti or simply an aggressive wild animal. But there were no tracks, no signs of an animal attack, and the injuries don't match any known creature's attack pattern. Some researchers have pointed to reports from other hikers in the region around the same time. Several groups reported seeing strange orange orbs or lights in the night sky over the mountains in February 1959. These reports came from multiple independent sources. Were they military flares, natural phenomena, something else? And could they be connected to what happened to Dyatlov's group? It's impossible to say, but the reports exist in the official record. Perhaps the most unsettling theory is the simplest. Something happened on that mountain that we simply don't understand yet. Some combination of natural phenomena, unusual circumstances, and human panic created a perfect storm of fatal decision. The hikers were woken by something, a sound, a vibration, a perceived threat, and in their confusion or fear, they made the worst possible choice. They fled their shelter. And once in the cold, a cascade of bad decisions, hypothermia-induced confusion, and the brutal environment finished what their panic started. In 2020, Russian prosecutors closed the case again, declaring the avalanche theory as the official explanation. Many experts and researchers reject this conclusion, pointing to the unresolved questions and conflicting evidence. The debate continues in forums, documentaries, and academic papers. New technologies have allowed researchers to analyze the scene and the evidence in ways that weren't possible in 1959. But even with modern science, the mystery persists. What we know for certain is this: 9 intelligent, experienced, capable young people entered the Ural Mountains in February 1959. Something happened on the night of February 1st that terrified them so completely that they cut their way out of their tent and walked to their deaths in the frozen wilderness. Some died from the cold. Others suffered massive traumatic injuries from an unknown source. The Soviet government investigated, documented strange and troubling details, and then closed the case without a satisfactory explanation. The families of the victims have never received real closure. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor who turned back before the final leg of the journey, spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened to his friends. He died in 2013, still without answers. The place where they died is now known as Dyatlov Pass, named after the leader who never brought his group home. It has become a pilgrimage site for hikers and mystery enthusiasts, a place where people come to stand where those 9 stood and try to understand what they experienced in their final hours. The mountain still stands, cold and silent in the Urals. It keeps its secrets. It remembers what happened that night, even if we never will. 9 young lives ended there for reasons we may never fully understand, and that, perhaps, is what makes this mystery so haunting. It's not a crime with a perpetrator to catch. It's not a puzzle with a clear solution. It's a reminder that there are still things in this world, forces, phenomena, circumstances that defy our understanding. Sometimes people vanish into the ocean without a trace, and sometimes they flee into the frozen darkness for reasons that died with them. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries, and it's likely to stay that way.